In this presentation, we're going to talk about the history of modern Guatemala. So we'll really focus on the time between 1900 and the present, with most of what we're focusing on coming from the Great Depression forward. But we'll also go back a little further than that to provide some more context. The major trends that we're going to be talking about as we look at Guatemala's recent history include these. We're going to talk about independence and caudillos, dictatorships and neocolonialism, which were part of that movement for order and progress of the late 19th century that included things like scientific racism. We're going to look at the US influence on Guatemala and Central America and the creation of Guatemala as what is known as a banana republic. 1944, there was a revolution, and after that, a decade of a democratic system in Guatemala for the first time in its history. That has been called the 10 years of spring by some observers, so we'll look at that. 1954, that all came to an end with a CIA-backed coup that ushered in a murderous civil war, which lasted for over 36 years. I mean, the civil wars counted from different starting points depending on who's studying it, but it didn't end officially until 1996. And there are still remnants of that issue of the violence that continue in Guatemala today. So those are the last couple of issues that we'll finish with. If you want a good general timeline of Guatemala's history, these two links will provide those for you, so you can just have kind of a general reference of Guatemala's overall history. And besides the fact that we're going to Antigua on our study abroad trip in May, Guatemala, I chose it for another reason as well, that it provides a really good case study of the various trends that we've already talked about in Latin American history, and it even provides kind of the extremes of those things, the extremes of neocolonialism and having an outside foreign-owned corporation dictating economics and political policy. That was the United Fruit Company that did that. It also had the kind of extreme in terms of the US Cold War response through the CIA-backed coup that I already alluded to. So those are some of the reasons that we're looking at Guatemala in this unit. Just briefly, Guatemala gained its independence along with Mexico in 1821 and along with the rest of Central America that same year. Guatemala was not an independent nation in 1821, although Independence Day is still celebrated on September 15th, which was that early date for independence when the United Provinces of Central America were created. Civil wars took place, especially strong between about 1838 and 1840, that broke apart the United Provinces of Central America into the various nations that you can see on that infographic map. This stock photograph here is an illustration of an Independence Day celebration in Antigua that took place not too long ago. Here is a close-up map of Guatemala with a few of the kind of touristy sites highlighted on it that you may have heard of. People visit these places a lot. Guatemala City is right there. Not too far from Antigua and Lake Atitlan. Those are two places that we will be going on our trip in May. So again, if you're interested in that and you haven't yet applied, let me know if you have any questions. Guatemala, as you can see, is bordered by Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and down here that you can't see is El Salvador. Although Guatemala was one of the nations that had Criollo rule early on, which those were the people who claimed pure Spanish ancestry but had been born in the Americas. It faced a series of internal strife and conflicts in which caudillos, or strongmen, came out on top. These were kind of the main figures from about the 1860s through the 1920s that held power in Guatemala. Manuel Estrada Cabrera held power between 1898 and 1920. This was the longest continuous dictatorship in Central America for the whole kind of independence era. All of these guys, though, were focused on modernization. So much like Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, They wanted to bring order and progress to Guatemala. And to do that, they were willing to give major concessions to foreign enterprises. So this is like the United Fruit Company. There were smaller examples of other companies that were also trying to get a foothold in Guatemala, but United Fruit was really the largest one that controlled not just the economy, not just the production of bananas and sugar, but also politics as well. Had such a strong influence that these guys were willing to give in to meaning the company's whims. All right. And as you might imagine, none of those dictators were very hospitable toward their own people. They intensified and created conflicts between the Mayan people, the indigenous folks, and the Ladino population, which were the mestizos, or those of a mixed heritage. They did that because it created conflict in society that allowed them to stay in power and allowed them to continue to give these concessions to United Fruit, which there were a lot of kickbacks and profits to be made for the elites in Guatemala from the system through which United Fruit dominated the country. But for most of its people, that was not the case. As you can see here, most of the people in Guatemala, especially the Mayan population, were essentially forced to work on banana estates that were owned by United Fruit or its subsidiaries. There were laws in place that, although they weren't called slavery laws, they meant that Mayan people had to sign labor contracts. They had to be at the estate, I should say, during specified times, and if they weren't, they could be arrested for vagrancy violations. So these vagrancy laws were, again, just meant to keep Mayan people principally working and providing cheap labor for United Fruit. The United Fruit Company is an example of one of the first or earliest multinational corporations that came out of the United States. There were a couple others that were producing steel and oil that were not only from the US, but also Great Britain around the turn of the 20th century. But these corporations found that by following vertical integration, that means not just owning land and the banana fields and the sugar fields, but also owning the means of transportation and supply. So railroads, United Fruit had railroad contracts and built railroads in Guatemala and in Costa Rica and elsewhere in Central America. By controlling all of these things, they could control the prices and keep them very low so the profits would be very high. Also, United Fruit launched a major ad campaign in the United States to sell bananas. Prior to the early 1900s, bananas weren't really that readily available in a lot of places in the United States. United Fruit wanted to educate people about the food value, the health benefits of eating bananas, give them ideas about recipes for breakfast, for example. These kinds of things were going on through the 1960s and even the 1970s. The Chiquita Banana Company is actually the descendant of United Fruit when it was broken up at least a little bit into smaller companies in the 1960s and 1970s. I want to take just a moment here and look at some photographs from the turn of the 20th century from Guatemala. I was fortunate enough to get a grant to go to the Nettie Benson Latin American Library at the University of Texas at Austin this last summer and do some research. And I was able to look at this photograph album that is held there in that archive. So these are photographs from an American woman named Mary Hammond. It's not clear that she took all of these, but she was the one that submitted the photograph album to the board of the Presbyterian Church in New York. The Presbyterian Church was one of many Protestant churches from the United States that was sending missionaries and others into Latin American countries to try to win converts. Many of these people could be pretty racist toward indigenous folks in these Latin American nations, but these photographs provide us some interesting views of what Guatemala looked like at the turn of the 20th century. All of these photographs were taken between 1883 and 1904. And there are about 80 of them total. I'm going to show you a few of them here, but if you want to look at all of them, just click on the yellow title here, and it will take you to a copy of the entire photograph album. This first one is of the Central Plaza in Antigua. You can see the Agua volcano behind the plaza there. Here's another view from Antigua with ruins in the foreground and the volcano again in the background. These kinds of photographs were interesting. These were certainly not taken by one of the Presbyterians, but at a studio in Guatemala City, most likely, much like was done in the United States in the late 19th century. Indigenous people were posed for photographs so that they could kind of show off their dress and a little bit their life ways. But these two photographs, I think, were kind of striking from this album because they illustrate, at least on the surface, some of the differences economically between people within the Mayan group. So we often lump these people together, but of course there were distinctions among Mayans themselves and among Ladinos and among the elite as well. Here's a photograph showing the weaving practices among some Guatemalan Mayans. And this shows some members of one of these communities who had come together and thinking about the differences in technology. Imagine how long they probably had to stand there to pose for that photograph. These two show a carbonero, or a coal miner, essentially, and also someone who would work to haul things for all intents and purposes. So these are some of the things that Mayan men would have worked at, besides working in the banana fields in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then this last one, there's not a lot of information written about these photographs. Wherever there was a caption, I included it, so you saw some of those written on the side in these photographs here. This one didn't have one, and I imagine it's probably a family of Presbyterians who came to Guatemala, since that's where this photo album came from. But also, around the turn of the 20th century, there were a lot of Germans who were migrating into Guatemala. Many of them were not missionaries, but bought plantations and large estates, and they weren't necessarily connected to United Fruit, but they were connected to the practice of employing Mayan people on their estates through contract labor that forced them to be there for small wages whenever essentially the employer needed them to be there. Those kinds of labor practices, in rural areas and also in urban areas, were further compounded under the leadership of Jorge Ubico. Ubico was the dictator in Guatemala between 1931 and 1944. During the Great Depression, in efforts to try to diminish civil unrest and also to try to help build the economy at least a little bit, he changed a few of the laws. He changed some of the contract labor laws, but he still left vagrancy laws in place, for example, in rural areas. In urban areas, he allowed limited unionization, but on the terms set by his government. And he also raised wages for certain public servants. Teachers were not included, though, among those who received the wages, and voicing a lot of different concerns about the economy and about the lack of rights under his regime. Students and teachers protested quite frequently in 1943 and 44 in Guatemala City. Among these was this woman here. Her name was Maria Chinchilla. She was a teacher at primary school in Guatemala City, and in response to violent quashing of a student protest at the university in Guatemala City, the next day she and other female teachers marched peacefully, holding signs, something like this, in the streets of the city. This is also her on this truck among a group of protesters to protest the violence of the military under Jorge Ubico against the Guatemalan people, and the way that he still gave preference to United Fruit and other outside entities. In the process of that protest, though, the military showed up and opened fire on the protesters. Chinchilla was struck in the face, and she was killed immediately. In response to that, the protests galvanized and continued. Ubico was forced to step down on July 1st, 1944, and in the wake of his resignation, new, for the first time ever, open democratic elections were held, in the fall of 1944. In those elections, this man here on the right, named Juan Jose Arevalo, was elected and became president of Guatemala. Again, this was the first democratic election ever in Guatemala that was a free and open democratic election. Arevalo won, and he created a new constitution in 1945 that was modeled on the Constitution of 1917 that was signed in Mexico after its revolution. That was one of the most progressive constitutions of its time. It allowed for labor organizing. It set some restrictions on separations of church and state, although in Guatemala, not even as much. It also provided for education. It provided for land ownership for rural folks. It sought to break up some of the large land holdings, although the Constitution didn't go very far in that regard. Also in 1947, Arevalo issued a new labor decree that formalized and legalized unionization and helped the wages of urban laborers across Guatemala go up. When his term was over, and I should also point out, Arevalo called himself a spiritual socialist. A little unclear quite what he meant by that, but it seems that principally what he was talking about was having Guatemala for the Guatemalans. The profits of Guatemalan labor should go to support the people of Guatemala and no longer should go outside to support foreign corporations, just in a nutshell. His successor was one of the people who was very active in the military during the Guatemalan Revolution. His name was Jacobo Arbenz. He won election in 1950. And so this was the first ever peaceful transition of power in Guatemala as well. And he continued to build on a lot of Arevalo's initiatives. His most controversial and most famous initiative was Decree 900. This was agrarian reform. And what this agrarian reform law did is it redistributed the lands of large corporations like United Fruit or large estates to the Guatemalan people. And that's what the sign, this was a photograph from Life magazine, is talking about. This was up in the countryside in Guatemala in 1952-53, saying that President Arbenz has come through. He's kept his promises to rural laborers, and he is working to give land to those people so that they can have their own land that they can work on and become self-sufficient. One of the problems was United Fruit Company. Under Decree 900, which again was issued in in July of 1952. Under this law, there would be a 3% interest rate paid on the last taxed value of unused lands on large estates. For United Fruit, about 85% of the land that it held was unused or left fallow. There were a variety of reasons that the corporation claimed it was doing that to shore up against crop failures or whatever it might be in the future. But the bottom line was most of its land was not being cultivated in 1952. And United Fruit had consistently devalued its taxes as part of those cycles of concessions that had been granted. And so based on the Arbenz government's figures, it offered United Fruit $627,000 for the lands that it was going to take from United Fruit and redistribute to the campesinos. The U.S. State Department, on the other hand, representing United Fruit to the government in Guatemala, countered and said, no, these lands are worth at least $15 million. So you can see the huge discrepancy there. people in United Fruit and those who had been the opposition to both of these guys, and these were people who had supported Biko. In some sectors, the Catholic Church opposed the policies that were being enacted under Arevalo and Arbenz. And also, this was the beginning of the Cold War. Both of these guys allowed the Guatemalan Communist Party to exist and be legal, although neither was active in the party. Both had advisors that were. All of these things spelled trouble from the perspective of the United Fruit Company and the United States. These are a couple of handbills that were part of that research trip that I made to the Benson Library that I mentioned a minute ago. The one on the left is in support of the labor laws, the new labor code in 1947 that I mentioned. And so this is telling workers, that your rights are now upheld legally by the Arevalo government. This other one here is an anti-communist flyer, and these were both flyers that were disseminated in the streets in Guatemala City and other major cities. Well, there aren't many major cities, but other cities in Guatemala that says we need to get the communists out of our country because they're making it so that we don't have much agrarian production. We're not producing as many bananas, as much sugar, and it's not bringing as much money into the country, which wasn't necessarily true, but this was the line that the United Fruit Company was putting forth, that the United States government under Eisenhower was accepting. And there were a lot of connections between the United Fruit Company and the Eisenhower government. So all of this came together to create a perfect storm in which this guy on the left, Carlos Castillo Armas, he was a member of the Guatemalan opposition who had been educated in the United States, so he had connections to the US. He was interested in opposing Arbenz in the 1950s, and he was tapped by the CIA to lead an insurgency against the Arbenz government. This is a map from the period. Castillo Armas and his forces, they were part of a group called the MLN, or the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Movement. They were outfitted in Honduras. They were given some old World War II planes from the United States, from the CIA. They were given radio equipment, and they transmitted anti-Arbenz programs and messages into the countryside. They only had a few hundred people supporting them, but they made it seem like they had a lot more because of the technology of radio, because of the airplanes, because of the weapons that they had received. And also on this slide, of course, this is President Eisenhower, pictured here with John Foster Dulles, who was his Secretary of State, and Dulles' brother Alan, right here, was the head of the CIA. The Dulles brothers had both worked for a law firm that had represented and had been given a lot of money from United Fruit. There were some other people in the Eisenhower cabinet with those connections as well. And so again, they all supported this covert operation led by the CIA. Again, the CIA not having Americans involved, but having Guatemalans under Castillo Armas lead the charge. This was called Operation PB Success. And here's some photographs from the violence there. Here's Castillo Armas. The propaganda initiative worked in Guatemala. When Castillo Armas started to lead a charge across the border from Honduras in 1954, Arbenz thought that he had a much larger army at his command. He also started to lose the support of the Guatemalan armed forces. Because of that, he lost his nerve and he resigned. So here's a photograph of Arbenz being checked at the airport as he left and fled into exile after relinquishing the presidency. The photo at the bottom shows the processions when Castillo Armas took the presidency. And then this is a mural by Diego Rivera, the Mexican artist, that shows Castillo Armas shaking John Foster Dulles' hand right there in the middle. And of course, you can see the dead bodies strewn around beneath him, the green bananas packaged over on the left-hand side. Again, a very damning image of what had gone on in 1954 in Guatemala. Perhaps most significantly, the coup ushered in by the CIA that brought Castillo Armas to power ushered in a long, drawn-out, extremely violent civil war in Guatemala that, depending on how scholars count it, lasted for about 36 years or so. So I've numbered it 1961 to 1996, but some of the beginnings of that civil war were before 1961. Some of the residue of that civil war continues even today. So a very horrible and dark period in Guatemala's history in many ways, but one that's important to understand something about, I think. The men over here on the right-hand side of the screen, and I know you can't see the guy on the bottom, I apologize for that design error, but these were some of the military dictators of this period of civil war. Beginning with Manuel Ydígoras Fuentes. He took power after Castillo Armas was assassinated in 1957. 1963, a coup was led against him. Because of that problem of not having any kind of regular succession of the leader, the military decided it would be a good idea to have a civilian in power. So that was Julio César Méndez Montenegro. He was actually an associate of Arévalos, and he was in power from 1966 to 1970. I say it that way because there wasn't really a democratic election. The military made the decision about who they would allow to be on the ballot and how they would message that. And so ballots, for all intents and purposes, were just sort of pretenses, shows at making it seem that there was some semblance of democracy going on. While Méndez Montenegro was in power, the military was actually running the show. He was a civilian face of the administration, but not really much else. In 1970, Carlos Arana Osorio took the helm. He was known as the Butcher for a horrible massacre that he led in the town of Zacapa in 1968. At that point, he was running a counterinsurgency that was supported by the United States. They had provided training and weapons to go after leftist militants, guerrillas, and Arana Osorio really heightened the civil war. So again, with his tenure as a military officer prior to his tenure as president, deaths really went on the rise. Paramilitary death squads multiplied. There were many of these that were sponsored and supported by the state. Some of their names included things like La Mano Blanca, the white hand, Ojo por Ojo, an eye for an eye. And again, their goal was to root out what they saw as a communist threat from the guerrillas that were threatening to and trying to unseat these very repressive military regimes. Romeo Lucas Garcia, who you can't see there, was in power from 1978 to 1982, and you can tell I've skipped a few of the leaders, but the overall message and the trajectory is kind of the same. Very little impunity for massive amounts of state violence against the people of Guatemala. Who were they fighting against? Well, among these groups were the Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes, or the FAR. This was an openly Marxist guerrilla group that was challenging the authority of the state in the 1960s and 70s. Also, there was another group called the MR-13 that was openly Marxist that fielded guerrillas as well. The image of the Guatemalan Workers' Party, or the Partido Guatemalteco de Trabajo, that's the older communist party that was more of an institutional political party, had very little to do actually with the guerrilla movements, although it still existed in Guatemala. So also trying to emphasize there were many different fractious political parties, despite the heavy-handed power of the military during the Civil War era. And in the middle of all of this, campesinos in the fields in rural Guatemala, these Mayans that we've talked about, that many of whom benefited from agrarian reform, from the constitutional reforms of 1945, from the labor laws, they found themselves caught in the middle of this. Some of them were just slaughtered, as in the case that I mentioned, in which Arana Osorio led the counterinsurgency in the countryside. That only increased in the 1980s. This image here, the people that were sought for justice, we should bring them to justice. These were members of what became known as that MR13 group that I mentioned a second ago. The man you see most of here is Efrain Rios Montt. He took power in 1982, was only in power for about 18 months, but during his tenure in office, the death rate just spiked. There were more and more disappearances. His administration presided over a horrific genocide of Mayan peoples, various sites, especially in northern and eastern Guatemala. So not only were people like Rios Montt trying to defend against communism, but they saw indigenous people as fomenting and harboring communists as well. So they believed that these kinds of casualties were more or less just collateral damage in their efforts to rid Guatemala of this communist presence. And of course, in the United States, Ronald Reagan reinvigorated the Cold War during his administration in the 1980s. In the center there, you can see him at a meeting with Efrain Rios Montt in 1982. Reagan infamously, famously, however you want to look at it, supported the Rios Montt regime that most international observers see as having been responsible for genocide against the Mayans. The other man that's pictured here, excuse me, so the other man that's pictured here is Otto Perez Molina. He's here in this photograph in the early 80s. Actually, I think that's the 90s, as one of the head officers of the Guatemalan military. He later became president of Guatemala. Here he is in 2015. That's a purposely conspicuous photo because the other side, famously not last year, 2 years ago now in 2015, protests via Twitter began with the hashtag Renuncia Ya that forced him to step down from office. So just to emphasize a couple of things by bringing up Perez Molina, he was one of the orchestrators of genocide under Rios Montt, yet he was able to gain the presidency in the 2010s, so within the last few years. He was removed from power not because of his implications of having participated in the genocide, but because of the corruption of his administration. And that's been an ongoing problem for Guatemalan administrations from 2000 forward, is a horrible plague of corruption, of being connected to narcos, of drug dealing, of course, of bribery, of money laundering, of all these sorts of horrific things that they're using the government for. He was actually forced from power, though, through a Twitter campaign. And if you click on this image, if you get the slides, that will take you to an episode of Radio Ambulante that I've also assigned, if you get the chance, for this section of the unit that tells that story of how he was forced from power. So all of this is to say that Guatemala is still reeling from the legacy of these civil wars. Of course, culture is very strong. Mayan weaving, Mayan culinary traditions. The landscapes of Guatemala are breathtaking and wonderful, and people love to go there. But it's all kind of alongside this horrible story of ethnic strife and civil war that we've just outlined. This last slide shows the efforts of the Guatemalan Truth Commission. There were actually two Truth Commissions, one that was sponsored by the UN. That's the one that you can see right here, the Memory of Silence. There was another that was run by the Catholic Church. If you click the Memory of Silence on the slides, you'll get to the archive of the National Police of Guatemala City. That archive is housed by the University of Texas, Austin, by the Benson Library that I've mentioned, and you can go and access it there. Um, it has the records of torture and abuse and deaths and disappearances that were orchestrated by the police in it. And it was kind of a miracle that it was found in 2005 that the regime hadn't burned it down. That's something that also provides a basis for trying to bring the perpetrators of torture and human rights violations to justice in Guatemala. There are photographers and artists. If you click here, this will take you to a story about the photography of Daniel Hernandez. He is one that designed a cover, this angel wings man who is in a few different poses there to illustrate the difficult legacies surrounding all of this. And of course, the largest photo here is showing the exhuming of bodies in mass graves. Now with the DNA technology and other things that we have, the UN and other groups have gone to assist people with trying to find their loved ones so that they can give them a proper burial and finally have closure. It says here, this was just painted on a wall in Guatemala City, justice for the genocide. And there still is a debate in Guatemala, those who believe there was a genocide and those who say there wasn't. In 2013, Efrain Rios Montt was actually convicted of genocide by a Guatemalan court, although that was overturned and appeals have hit up against the problem that he's now well into his 80s and he has dementia. And so there doesn't look like there's a good chance of having a conviction there. But other kind of more minor members of the military have been convicted. And all of this is to say, there's this ongoing effort to try to bring closure and bring justice to Guatemala for all of these acts that were perpetrated against the Guatemalan people. All right, let's wind it up here. Thank you for listening to this presentation on Guatemalan history. Please let me know what questions you have and we can talk further about these things. Also, I'm going to provide a link to some music by Rebecca Lane, who is a Guatemalan hip-hop artist. She has a couple of songs on her newest album that reflect some of the issues that we've talked about here. So if you understand Spanish and are interested, or even if you don't, give that a listen and see what